The FBI didn't knock the door down right away. They listened first. For years, agents sat in vans, basements, hotel rooms, and empty offices wearing headphones while America's most powerful criminals talked freely. They complained, they planned, they trusted the wrong people. These were not sting operations that lasted a night. Some ran for years, bugs hidden in social clubs, undercover agents living double lives so deep that extraction meant survival. What you're about to hear comes straight from FBI files, court transcripts, and sworn testimony. Conversations criminals never expected anyone else to hear, decisions that triggered disappearances, and investigations that didn't end with arrests, but with entire crime families collapsing under their own secrets. It started at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy, Manhattan, where the Ravenite social club sat behind a plain storefront and a heavy door. By the late 1980s, this address had become headquarters for John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino crime family, and a daily meeting point for his inner circle. Gotti had a reputation in the press as the Teflon Don, a nickname tied to the way earlier cases against him failed to stick. Inside law enforcement, the idea of Teflon had a simpler meaning. They needed better evidence. Surveillance teams could photograph who came and went, and informants could tell stories, but prosecutors wanted Gotti's own words on tape, in places where Gambino business was handled. Federal court orders eventually authorized the interception of oral communications at specific locations connected to the Ravenite. Those authorizations covered electronic surveillance in and around the club and areas tied to it, because investigators believed the real decisions were being made there. The key break was not only the club itself. Investigators learned that when Gotti wanted to speak more freely, he used an apartment in the building above the Ravenite as a more private meeting space. The FBI installed listening devices that captured conversations between Gotti and top Gambino figures, including Frankie Locascio, his consigliere, and Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, a high-ranking Gambino member who was part of Gotti's administration. Recordings from that apartment became central evidence, including a captured meeting dated January 17, 1990, that later appears in federal court decisions describing who was present and what was discussed. By late 1990, the investigation had moved from gathering intelligence to building a racketeering case designed to hold leadership accountable. On December 11, 1990, John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio were arrested in a sweep tied to the case that would follow. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the intercepted recordings to argue that Gotti's own voice connected him to murders, racketeering, and the day-to-day direction of the crime family. In 1992, Gotti was convicted in federal court, and he was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In practical terms, the Bugs did more than add evidence to a file. They changed the public image. The Teflon Don label depended on the idea that nothing could be proven. The recordings from the Ravenite building helped strip that way because jurors were hearing the case in Gotti's own language, in conversations prosecutors argued were the business meetings of a criminal organization. On November 14, 1957, a quiet stretch of road outside the village of Apalachin, New York, became the center of the American underworld. The location was the home of Joseph Barbara, a longtime mob figure who lived on a rural estate at 625 McFall Road. That morning, luxury cars began arriving from across the country, many with out-of-state plates. Men in tailored suits stepped onto the gravel driveway, some of them among the most powerful figures in organized crime in the United States. The gathering was not advertised, and there were no written invitations. Law enforcement later determined it was a nationwide Mafia meeting, called to address leadership disputes and business interests following the attempted murder of Frank Costello and the growing power of Vito Genovese, a major New York crime figure who was seeking formal recognition as the dominant boss in the city. The guest list eventually revealed representation from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, and as far west as California. Local New York State Police had already taken notice. Trooper Edgar Croswell had been monitoring Barbara's property due to his known criminal associations and the sudden activity around the house. When he observed the unusual number of vehicles and unfamiliar faces, he alerted additional units. Roadblocks were quietly set up on nearby routes. When police moved in, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. Dozens of men fled the property, abandoning cars and personal belongings. Some ran into nearby fields and thick woods, still wearing business suits and polished shoes. Others attempted to drive away and were stopped at roadblocks. In total, 58 men were detained. Many carried thousands of dollars in cash, and several gave vague or contradictory explanations for their presence, claiming they were attending a barbecue or visiting a sick friend. Among those taken into custody were some of the most senior Mafia leaders in the country, including bosses, underbosses, and capos from multiple crime families. The arrest did not result in long prison sentences. Most charges were eventually dismissed or reduced to minor offenses, like failure to register as gamblers. What mattered was not the courtroom outcome, but what the raid revealed. Up to that point, the FBI under Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly downplayed the existence of a national mafia organization. Hoover had maintained that organized crime was largely a collection of local gangs, not a centralized structure. Apalachin destroyed that position overnight. The sheer number of high-ranking figures gathered in one place from across the country made denial impossible. In the years that followed, the Apalachin raid reshaped federal law enforcement strategy. The FBI formally acknowledged the existence of La Cosa Nostra as a nationwide criminal organization. Organized crime squads expanded, intelligence sharing improved, long-term investigations targeting leadership rather than street-level operators became a priority. The men who ran through the woods that day were not caught planning a specific crime. What they exposed was more damaging, proof that American organized crime was real, coordinated, and national in scope. Once that truth was on record, it could not be taken back. In the summer of 2007, a federal courtroom in Chicago became the place where decades of silence finally broke. The case was officially titled United States versus Marcello, but it quickly became known as the Family Secrets Trial. For the first time, the FBI laid out the inner history of the Chicago outfit, not through rumors or street talk, but through sworn testimony, documents, and bodies that had been missing since the 1970s. At the center of the case was the Chicago outfit, the long-standing organized crime group that controlled gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets across the city and its suburbs. Unlike the New York families, the outfit had survived for decades with relatively few insider defections. Murders went unsolved. Victims disappeared. Orders were passed quietly, and loyalty was enforced with fear. That changed with Nick Calabrese. Calabrese was not a boss or a public figure. He was a soldier, a man trusted to carry out violence when orders came down. In the early 2000s, facing his own legal exposure, Calabrese agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. What he brought with him was memory, names, dates, locations, and admissions to murders that had never been officially solved. The investigation was run by the FBI's Chicago field office and prosecutors from the U.S. Department of Justice. Agents reopened cold cases going back more than 30 years. Disappearances from the 1970s and 1980s were matched with Calabrese's statements, physical evidence, and corroborating testimony. Victims included outfit members suspected of disloyalty, as well as associates who knew too much or crossed the wrong people. One of the most damaging aspects of Calabrese's cooperation was that it implicated leadership. The testimony described how murder decisions were approved at the top levels of the organization, including by men who had long avoided prosecution. Bodies had been buried in garages, basements, and remote locations. Some victims had been lured into what they believed were routine meetings and never came back. In June 2007, a federal grand jury indicted multiple defendants, including James Marcello, who prosecutors identified as a senior outfit leader. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple murders tied together under the RICO statute. For the first time, the government presented the outfit not as a collection of individual crimes, but as an organized system built on secrecy and enforced by killing. The trial exposed details that families of victims had waited decades to hear. Names of the dead were spoken in open court. Methods were described plainly. Calabrese testified for days, explaining his own role and the structure around him. His credibility was tested, but prosecutors supported his testimony with records, corroboration, and physical evidence recovered years after the crimes. In 2009, Marcello and other defendants were convicted. Marcello received a life sentence in federal prison. The verdicts closed some of the oldest unsolved murder cases in Chicago history. They also marked the most damaging blow to the outfit since the era of major prosecutions in the late 20th century. The family secrets trial did not end organized crime in Chicago. What it did was remove the protection of silence. Murders that had lived only as rumors were placed into the public record. For the first time, the Chicago outfit's history of violence was not whispered. It was documented, sworn to, and preserved in federal court. In September 1976, an FBI agent walked into a small jewelry store on Manhattan's Lower East Side and introduced himself as Donnie Brasco. The man behind the name was Joseph D. Pistone, a career federal agent assigned to one of the most dangerous long-term undercover operations in FBI history. What began as a limited infiltration would stretch into nearly 6 years inside the Bonanno crime family, with consequences that reshaped organized crime investigations in New York City. Pistone was born in Erie, Pennsylvania, and raised in a working-class Italian-American family. His background, accent, and mannerisms made him a credible candidate for deep cover. The FBI created the Donnie Brasco identity in detail, complete with backstop records, employment history, and a criminal profile designed to attract mob attention. Once inside, Pistone was cut off from his former life. His handlers knew that if his identity was exposed, there would be no rescue. The entry point came through Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, a longtime Bonanno soldier struggling to regain status within the family. Ruggiero took Pistone under his wing, introducing him to bookmakers, collectors, and eventually higher-ranking members. Over time, Pistone gained trust by being present, keeping his mouth shut and doing what he was told. He wore a wire during key meetings, recording conversations about extortion, drug trafficking, and internal disputes. By the late 1970s, Pistone was moving deeper into the organization. He traveled with mob members, handled cash, and was present for discussions that only trusted insiders were allowed to hear. According to later court records and FBI summaries, Pistone learned about planned murders and violent reprisals, information that was documented but often could not be acted on immediately without blowing his cover. The risk was constant and the psychological toll was severe. The operation became especially dangerous as Pistone came close to being formally inducted. At that time, induction would have required proof of loyalty through violence. FBI supervisors later testified that contingency plans were discussed in the event Pistone was ordered to kill. Those plans were never tested, but the possibility alone underscored how close the operation came to catastrophe. In 1981, the FBI ended the operation. Pistone was pulled out quietly, and indictments followed. The evidence collected through recordings, surveillance logs, and corroborating testimony led to more than 100 convictions of organized crime figures across multiple families. Within the Bonanno family, the damage was devastating. Leadership was exposed, internal trust collapsed, and violent retaliation followed against members suspected of allowing the infiltration. Lefty Ruggiero was arrested and later sentenced to prison, where he died in 1994. He never fully accepted that Donnie Brasco had been an FBI agent. For the Bureau, Operation Donnie Brasco became a turning point. It validated long-term undercover work against organized crime leadership and permanently altered how Mafia families vetted outsiders. Joe Pistone survived the operation, but his undercover identity never truly disappeared. He lived for years under threat, requiring security and relocation. The files from the case remain some of the most detailed records ever compiled on the inner workings of a New York crime family. Not because of informants after the fact, but because an FBI agent lived inside it. day after day, knowing one mistake would be fatal. By the late 1970s, federal agents were spending their days listening to kitchens. Not restaurants in the traditional sense, but small pizzerias scattered across New York, New Jersey, the Midwest, and parts of the Northeast. Behind the clatter of dishes and the hum of refrigerators, the FBI believed something much larger was moving: heroin, imported in bulk, distributed quietly, and coordinated through businesses that looked harmless from the street. The investigation that followed became known as the Pizza Connection case. It targeted a transatlantic heroin trafficking network tied to the Sicilian Mafia and its American partners. According to federal indictments, heroin was produced in laboratories in Sicily, shipped through international routes, and distributed in the United States using pizzerias as meeting points, message drops, and covers for cash movement. At the center of the case was Gaetano Badalamenti, a senior Sicilian mafia figure who prosecutors identified as a key coordinator of the operation. Badalamenti was accused of overseeing a network that linked Sicilian suppliers with American distributors connected to organized crime families in New York. The pizzerias were not all owned by mobsters, but many were controlled or influenced by people who understood their real purpose. Federal agents relied heavily on electronic surveillance. Court-authorized wiretaps were placed in pizzerias, back rooms, and meeting locations. The recordings captured conversations in Italian and Sicilian dialects, often layered with coded language. Food terms stood in for narcotics. Quantities were disguised as orders. Background noise from kitchens filled the tapes. Ovens opening, plates moving, employees passing through while drug trafficking was discussed a few feet away. The surveillance ran for months and in some cases, years. Agents logged conversations around the clock, translating, cross-referencing names and mapping connections between defendants spread across multiple states and countries. The sheer volume of intercepted material became one of the defining features of the case. Prosecutors later described it as one of the most extensive wiretap operations ever used in a narcotics prosecution at that time. The case broke open publicly in 1984 with a sweeping indictment filed in federal court in New York. More than a dozen defendants were charged with narcotics trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. Prosecutors alleged the network was responsible for importing and distributing enormous quantities of heroin. Estimates presented in court ranged from hundreds of millions of dollars to figures approaching $1 billion in total value over the life of the conspiracy. Those numbers reflected prosecutorial allegations, not precise accounting, but they underscored the scale the government was claiming. One of the most damaging blows to the defendants came from cooperating witness Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking Sicilian mafioso who had already begun cooperating with Italian authorities. Buscetta's testimony helped explain the structure of the Sicilian Mafia and how it coordinated with American partners. His cooperation gave context to what jurors were hearing on the tapes and tied coded conversations to real-world actions. The trial itself became one of the longest federal criminal trials in U.S. history. It stretched from 1985 into 1987. Jurors were asked to follow years of surveillance, translations, financial records, and testimony. In 1987, Badalamenti and several defendants were convicted. Badalamenti received a sentence of 45 years in federal prison. The Pizza Connection tapes did more than secure convictions. They demonstrated how ordinary businesses could be used as infrastructure for international crime. They showed the value of patient surveillance even when the evidence came wrapped in noise, accents, and half-spoken meanings. And they made clear that behind the image of corner pizzerias and neighborhood storefronts, a global heroin pipeline had been operating in plain sight. In the early 1970s, Las Vegas was selling itself as clean, corporate, and legitimate. Behind the casino lights, federal investigators were seeing something very different. According to FBI and Department of Justice files, major casinos on the Strip were being quietly looted before profits were ever reported. Cash was removed straight from counting rooms, never taxed, never logged, and never seen by regulators. The investigation that exposed it became known as Operation Strawman. The scheme centered on skimming. Casino cash, especially from table games, was diverted before it entered official accounting. That money was then funneled back to organized crime families in the Midwest and the East. Federal prosecutors later established that the operation benefited the Chicago outfit, the Kansas City crime family, and their associates, who had financial interests in several Las Vegas casinos, despite laws meant to keep mob figures out of the gaming industry. Key casinos tied to the case included the Stardust, Fremont, Hacienda, and Marina. While the casinos appeared to be owned by legitimate front men, FBI wiretaps and surveillance showed that real control often rested elsewhere. Money skimmed in Las Vegas was transported back to the Midwest, sometimes in cash shipments, sometimes through intermediaries who answered directly to mob leadership. Federal agents planted listening devices in casino counting rooms, hotel suites, and phone booths used by key figures. The recordings captured discussions about skimming amounts, delivery schedules, disputes over missing money, and instructions passed between Las Vegas managers and mob representatives. According to court records, these conversations tied casino operations directly to organized crime bosses hundreds of miles away. One of the central figures identified by prosecutors was Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, who managed the Stardust and Fremont casinos. Rosenthal was never convicted in Operation Strawman, but FBI files and later court testimony described him as a key casino operator connected to Chicago interests. Oversight and enforcement came from mob enforcers, including individuals tied to violent intimidation and murder conspiracies meant to protect the flow of money. The case began to break open publicly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In 1983, a federal grand jury returned indictments charging racketeering, conspiracy, and skimming offenses. The evidence painted a clear picture. Las Vegas casinos were not isolated businesses. They were revenue engines feeding organized crime networks across the country. Convictions followed. In 1986, several defendants linked to the Chicago outfit and Kansas City mob were found guilty. In 1988, outfit boss Anthony Spilotro and his brother Michael were murdered in Indiana, a killing later linked by prosecutors to internal mob discipline connected to Las Vegas disputes, though the murders themselves were prosecuted separately. Operation Strawman changed Las Vegas permanently. It led to tighter regulation, corporate ownership requirements, and the gradual removal of traditional mob influence from the Strip. For the FBI, the case proved that long-term electronic surveillance, combined with financial tracking, could dismantle complex skimming operations that had operated openly for years. The casinos survived. The mob control did not. What the wiretaps revealed was not style or mythology, but accounting. Cash taken early, profits hidden, and a city built on gambling quietly paying tribute to organized crime until the records caught up with the story. By 1982, John DeLorean was no longer the golden boy of the American auto industry. He was a former General Motors executive, the creator of the stainless steel DeLorean sports car, and the public face of a company that was collapsing under debt, failed projections, and government scrutiny. What followed placed him at the center of one of the strangest undercover operations the FBI ever ran. John DeLorean built his reputation at General Motors, where he rose quickly and became one of the youngest division heads in the company's history. He later left to form the DeLorean Motor Company, promising innovation and independence. The factory was built in Dunmurry, Northern Ireland, backed by British government funding. By the early 1980s, the company was bleeding cash. Production stalled. Credit dried up. DeLorean was desperate for financing. That desperation drew the attention of federal authorities. In 1981, DeLorean was introduced to James Timothy Hoffman, a convicted drug trafficker who had become a government informant. Hoffman claimed he could connect DeLorean to investors with access to large amounts of cash. What DeLorean did not know was that Hoffman was working with the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Administration, and that the entire scenario was being carefully engineered. The deal that followed was presented as a cocaine transaction. DeLorean was told that profits from moving a large shipment could be used to save his company. Meetings were recorded, phone calls were logged, conversations were captured on audio and video. The FBI documented DeLorean discussing the logistics of the deal, including financing and distribution. In one recorded statement, DeLorean was heard saying the transaction was better than gold. On October 19, 1982, federal agents arrested DeLorean in a Los Angeles hotel room. The charges alleged conspiracy to distribute cocaine. The arrest was public, dramatic, and devastating to his reputation. News coverage moved fast. The image of a once celebrated executive now facing federal drug charges became a national spectacle. At trial, DeLorean's defense focused on entrapment. His attorneys argued that the government, through Hoffman, had exploited his financial collapse and actively pushed him toward a crime he would not have otherwise committed. Evidence showed that Hoffman had repeatedly pressured DeLorean and played on his fear of losing everything. The jury heard the recordings, saw the footage, and weighed the conduct of both sides. In 1984, DeLorean was acquitted. The jury accepted the entrapment defense. The court ruled that while DeLorean had discussed the deal, the government's actions crossed the line into inducing criminal behavior. Legally, he walked free. Financially and professionally, he did not recover. The DeLorean Motor Company was already gone. His public standing was permanently damaged. The DeLorean Sting remains controversial. It is cited in law schools and legal analyses as a defining entrapment case. FBI records confirm the scope of the surveillance and the deliberate construction of the operation. What the files also show is a case where ambition, collapse, and federal pressure collided in a way that left no clean outcome. Hollywood liked the story because it looked unreal. Federal records show it was not. Every meeting was recorded, every move was planned, and one of the most unconventional stings in FBI history ended not with a conviction, but with a warning about how far an investigation can go before it undermines itself. On December 11, 1978, more than $5 million in cash and jewelry vanished from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. It was the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. The FBI immediately understood that the theft itself was only the beginning. What followed was a slow, violent unraveling that played out across New York City and filled federal files with death reports, informant statements, and surveillance logs. The heist was orchestrated by James Burke, also known as Jimmy Burke, a powerful associate of the Lucchese crime family. Burke was not a made man, but he operated with protection from Lucchese capo Paul Vario, who controlled much of the family's operations at JFK Airport. Burke assembled a crew of experienced criminals, many of them connected to hijacking rings and organized theft operations. From the start, Burke made his position clear to those around him. Anyone who talked, attracted attention, or mishandled the money would be dealt with. FBI interviews and later court testimony confirmed that Burke feared two things: informants and greed. Both were common after large scores, and both could draw law enforcement directly to him. Within weeks of the robbery, bodies began to appear. On January 18, 1979, Richard Eaton was found dead in a burned-out car in New Jersey. Eaton had been involved in the disposal of the getaway van. His murder was quickly flagged by investigators as connected to the heist, based on timing and his known association with Burke. In February 1979, Thomas DeSimone, a violent enforcer tied to Burke, disappeared. DeSimone had been involved in multiple murders, including the killing of suspected informants. According to later testimony from cooperating witnesses, DeSimone himself was killed on Burke's orders because his violence was drawing attention. His body was never recovered. This account is widely accepted in federal records but cannot be physically confirmed due to the absence of remains. Other associates were killed in rapid succession. Martin Krugman, who had helped facilitate the robbery by providing inside information, vanished in January 1979 after repeatedly demanding his share of the money. FBI files and later testimony state that Krugman was lured to a meeting and murdered. His body was never found. This conclusion is based on informant statements and corroborating circumstantial evidence, not physical proof. On June 11, 1979, Louis Kafora and his wife Joanna Kafora were found murdered in their Brooklyn home. Investigators believe Kafora had been spending money too openly and had failed to properly launder his share. The double homicide intensified law enforcement focus on Burke's circle and reinforced the pattern the FBI was documenting. By late 1979, federal agents were describing the aftermath as a systematic cleanup. Surveillance reports and informant debriefings describe Burke isolating himself, reducing contact, and eliminating anyone he believed could connect him to the robbery. The paranoia was not unfounded. The size of the theft brought relentless attention from the FBI, the New York Police Department, and airport authorities. Despite the violence, Burke was never charged for the Lufthansa heist itself. The money was never recovered. Instead, federal prosecutors eventually dismantled him through other cases. In 1982, Burke was convicted in a separate federal case tied to point shaving, and later received additional sentences for murder based on cooperating witness testimony. He died in prison in 1996. The FBI's Lufthansa aftermath files do not read like a victory lap. They read like containment. Investigators understood who was responsible, documented the pattern of killings, and tracked the collapse of the crew. What they could not do was put the central figure on trial for the crime that caused it all. The heist made history. The aftermath left a trail of dead men, missing bodies, and unanswered questions. What the files show clearly is that the real cost of the Lufthansa robbery was paid long after the money disappeared.